So we wanted to know some of their biggest challenges as a couple.
I would say, certain issues with the kids. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have different ways of going about it. I mean, we're on the same page a lot of times, but a lot of times we have different approaches. And that can be a source of,
A discipline approach.
Crazy. Yeah.
Okay.
You don't want to set me off.
Yeah.
Were you ever worried that that Nick could shine poorly on your career or something like that?
No. That never crossed my mind. I mean, he's my son. I love him. It doesn't matter. He's more important than anything that could happen to me.
With reflection also came regret. In a 2016 interview with the New York Post, Rob declaring he felt like he and Michelle had made mistakes in their efforts to help Nick by sending him to more than a dozen rehab centers, asserting, "To be honest, we overreacted. It's one thing to keep someone safe, but most of these programs are punitive."
It's ironic that right now the Reiner family have sort of put boundaries up in terms of Nick. That's the word the media are actually using, boundaries. Boundaries in the sense of not visiting Nick while he languishes in jail, and boundaries in the sense of apparently not paying for Nick's legal defense. In effect, they're not assisting Nick given the legal hole that he finds himself in, and they're not supporting him either. It's basically up to Nick to deal with the mess that he's in.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
And difficulties that you have are not, relegated to only, people who are unprivileged,
How bad did it get at home between the two of you?
It's reflected in the movie where the father character talks about how, he didn't know what to do, so he listened to anybody who had a desk and a diploma to do exactly what you're talking about. But the truth of the matter is, you have to be who you are. And I made mistakes in that I didn't go with my gut instinct. And this forced me to understand what he had been going through, and it forced him to understand what I and his mother had been going through, and the movie reflects that, and it definitely brought us closer together, and I'm really happy about that. I know Nick better than, some expert who's never met him, and I think had I listened to my own instincts, I would have done a lot better by Nick, but, you do what you do. You're a parent, and you think.
Now, before we begin on this topic of enmeshment, we need to be clear on what enmeshment isn't.
Rob Reiner, known for creating a nurturing, creative atmosphere on his film sets. He loved actors. He was an actor himself, enough that he didn't mind giving some of his actors line reading sometimes. But all of these reminiscences reflected in the graceful memories of so many of his actors.
Enmeshment is not nurturing. Nurturing is not enmeshment. Enmeshment is not closeness. Enmeshment is not intimacy. It's stifling. There's an element of duress in that closeness. It may not be immediately obvious. We know that there was something wrong in the nurturing environment at home, and it's not a mystery what that was because the Reiner family freely admit it.
Discipline approaches.
Discipline and those kind of things.
I'll give you the perfect example.
I'm like the grandfather.
It's like when the boys were little, they were like, I don't know, 4 and 6 before our daughter was born. And I said, we really need to teach them how to make a bed. And our oldest son, Jake, goes, but Daddy, you don't make your bed. And Rob went, he's right. All right, that's it. We don't have to. Yeah, so that's the discipline history of this household.
Right.
And even the kids complain that there aren't enough boundaries and that they weren't disciplined enough.
And that's something that I got from my parents.
Rob goes on to say that is something he got from his parents, that his parents didn't teach him discipline. And so I guess he didn't know how to discipline his children. Of course, he grew up in a family where the discipline came out of the regimen of needing to work, whereas in his family, that regimen wasn't really there because they were kind of born into a life of privilege. But there you heard, even from Rob's wife, Michelle, that even the kids complained that there weren't enough boundaries and that there wasn't enough discipline. Boundaries and discipline may seem to be a kind of enmeshment, and they certainly can be. If there's a stifling amount of boundaries, a stifling degree of discipline, that can become a kind of enmeshment. But you might well say, how can the absence of boundaries and the absence of discipline amount to enmeshment? And we're going to deal with that question. Let's put those words on screen. How can the absence of discipline amount to enmeshment? But before we get to that, I just want to say thank you to Alice Hendricks for your generous contribution. Thanks very much for that. Also, Figs591, thanks very much for that. If you're feeling appreciative of this content, please do also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. If enmeshment is tying yourself up in a family dynamic, then surely a lack of boundaries and a lack of discipline is not going to tie you up, is not going to enmesh, right? Wrong. The trouble with this loosey-goosey, warm and fuzzy approach is that while it may feel good in the moment, over time it manifests in very different ways, quite subtle ways. One of the most basic manifestations of enmeshment where there are no boundaries or discipline is that a child is so enmeshed, so cocooned, so coddled, that they actually fail to become individuals. And for a child in a famous household where there's a powerful or famous patriarch or a powerful couple, two, patriarch and a matriarch, that like Rob and Michelle were sometimes known as a power couple, it's easier still to luxuriate in that enmeshment. They basically carrying the entire family and all the individuals in it, kind of like a luxury yacht. It's also interesting to understand why this happens and how this happens.
Right. And even the kids complain that there aren't enough boundaries and that they weren't disciplined enough.
And that's something that I got from my parents. My parents didn't discipline me either. But maybe, I didn't act out or whatever. I don't know what it was, but I never got disciplined.
Really?
No.
And so you just don't understand why it's needed.
No, you got your kids, you love your kids. And
you may have heard him say that he's like the grandfather. And you know what grandparents are often like? They leave the disciplining to the parents. They kind of the good guys in terms of the children. Enmeshment may seem benign instead of as pernicious and as evil as it actually is, until the crisis hits when it's time to grow up, when it's time to do grown-up things, when it's time to go to the prom and you can't dance and you don't know what to say without some support around you. But think about other grown-up things like have a job, find love, be someone worthy of something, and then you see the enmeshment for what it is. When sometimes in your life you've got to come up with the discipline to do something worthwhile, even if it's, say, make a movie. Can you stand on your own and do something? Can you stand on your own and do anything? And so what that enmeshment does is it robs you of all your personal agency. It creates a barrier between yourself and the real world, which means when you finally come into contact with the real world, you're naked, you're weak, you're afraid, you have no idea how to deal with it. You can't stand on your own. And then being the son of or related to only gets you so far. And then your failure to become someone reveals itself to be a kind of existential laziness, a kind of individual wishy-washiness. It's a kind of trading on the laurels of others that you've been doing your whole life while failing to make anything of yourself. And other people see that, which of course is precisely the result you get when you are anybody with no discipline and no boundaries and you put no effort into anything. Because what you end up with is mediocre skills that set you up for a mediocre life.
Isn't he awesome, you guys? What? Dude, he just goes around imposing his will on people. He's my idol.
And if you think about it, two of the things that the characters in Misery and A Few Good Men, Lieutenant Caffey, a few of the things that these characters already have is that they have privilege, that they have respect, that they already born into a kind of privilege. That is something that Rob Reiner knew. And I think it's easy to imagine that you simply just are perhaps better than other people and you don't need any discipline or boundaries to make that happen. Well, they did in Nick Reiner's case. Now that we understand that there weren't proper boundaries in the Reiner household, and there weren't boundaries because there wasn't discipline, and there wasn't discipline because it seemed unnecessary given all of that excess, well, all of that leads to an unhealthy psychological state called enmeshment. Again, if you think it's harmless, think about what happened to Rob and Michelle and where Nick is now. And so now we really have to understand what enmeshment actually is. Do you want to know what the antonym is? The opposite word is for enmesh. It's free. Other words are let go, liberate, release. But it's not absolute freedom. It's freedom to allow someone to be themselves. But then there must also be a place for discipline, either self-discipline or them knowing that they need to discipline their liberation, their release. It might be through studies or training or whatever. To enmesh means to tangle, trap, ensnare, collar, mire, involve, mesh, net, and snare. To unenmesh means to detach, to disengage, to disentangle, to untangle, to extricate, and yes, to free and clear oneself of all of those strings. Let me ask you a question, though. Is a drug addict someone who knows anything about boundaries? Is a drug addict someone who knows about discipline?
Strings, but now I'm free.
My personal opinion is that they gave Nick too much freedom and too little discipline, and he took that and used that to become a drug addict. The boundaries were essentially all of those stints in rehab, and even that was something that they did away with, so they even took away that aspect. Now, being a puppet on strings is, I think, perhaps the simplest and best way of thinking about enmeshment. Think of Pinocchio and how when he develops a conscience, the first thing he wants is to be a real boy. He wants to be free. He doesn't want to be a puppet. He wants to have his own agency. But if he was born a puppet, he has no idea how to deal with the real world. And as such, the real world is a dangerous place, full of risks. The way to navigate the real world is by allowing oneself to be attracted into it and then develop not only the familiarity of it, but the agency to deal with it. And that happens when we encounter obstacles and learn, often painfully, how to overcome them. And over a period of time, it's like a child getting on a bicycle. How do we learn to ride the bicycle of life? How do we learn balance? How do we learn to avoid falling? Well, by doing. And of course, one of the first places Pinocchio goes when his strings are cut is to Pleasure Land, where he starts changing into a donkey. He starts sprouting ears and growing a tail. But he recognizes what is happening to people around him and himself, and he sees that isn't who he is, and he applies discipline to withdraw himself out of that situation. But you can't do that if you haven't been imbued with a sense of self to begin with. JonBenet Ramsey was effectively a puppet on her mother's strings, trained to perform on cue in order to become, some might argue, Miss America, her mother's idea of a dream for herself and her daughter. A daughter enmeshed in her mother's dreams. And is that what happened to Nick? He became enmeshed in his father's dreams. Anyway, to her credit, the little girl, if the housekeeper is to be believed, was rebelling against a lot of that in the last weeks and months of her life. Good for her, that is a healthy response. Today we're told that the pageants were just a little hobby, a weekend thing, and people in enmeshed situations are not surprisingly arch defenders of it. It's normal, they'll tell you. It's harmless, they'll insist. In the Reiner family, the enmeshment seems benign. So what if a family is very involved with each other? As long as they love each other, everything is fine, right? In a very real sense, what Nick did by killing his parents, both parents, he finally achieved what he needed to do, what all of us need to do at some point, which is that we let go of our parents.
I got no strings to hold me down, to make me fret or make me frown.
Cutting strings, while essential, is also rife with risk. It's that moment when little birds must leave the nest and the great world awaits with all of its perils. The trick is to find the balance between guiding a little bird into the world and puppeting it through every peril, through coddling. You know, the one fosters agency, the other robs the little duckling of it. And have a quick look at these little ducks trying to get up the stairs. That's something that they need to learn on their own. We learn by doing, not by being told what to do or having it done for us. Because whether it is early in life or late in life, the bright lights, the Vegases out there, the gambling, the drugs, the sex, the pleasant hedonism, that beckons to us constantly. It always offers instant but hollow joy and relief. But we don't become anyone worthwhile by engaging in those activities. And if we find ourselves in these pleasure lands and we don't have a sense of self, then our sense of self becomes this wishy-washy sense that being alive is simply and only about pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain, which is pretty much the mentality of a drug addict.
I had strings, but now I'm free. There are no strings on me.
The solution to enmeshment is thus individuation. It's from Carl Jung's analytical psychology. Individuation is the lifelong process of becoming a psychologically whole, unique individual, but in short, separating from others and from families, finding yourself and becoming who you are. In the simplest terms, individuation is you becoming who you are. You actualize yourself. Something inside you, something intangible, stands on its own and announces itself and demonstrates itself. It's something new, it's something unique, it's something new, it's something creative, something that develops, something that is born that wasn't there before. This is both horrible and terrible and traumatic, but also wonderful and liberating and magical to behold. The enmeshed person doesn't know it, but inside of themselves is a void, vast and empty. They sense it, but like Nick, they are powerless to fill it. All sins are attempts to fill voids. I hope that all of that is clear to you. In the next episode, we'll deal with this powerful subject in more detail. Individuation as the cure to enmeshment. How do we fill that void and become who we were meant to be? How do we raise children that reach their full potential? How do we reach our full potential? The answer lies in individuation. We must do, we must be, we must act. We must raise our children to do and be, in other words, with the boundaries and discipline in balance that the Reiners didn't have, in just the right combination. But how do we find the right combination, the right level of stress that is good for us and not harmful? How do we know what risks to take and not to take? And so we'll be dealing with that in the next episode, so look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.